In 1963, a quiet Scottish sheep farmer walked into the most prestigious motor race in the world, and the men who owned that race laughed at him. They laughed at his car, they laughed at his manners, they laughed at the fact that his engine was in the wrong place. 2 years later, that same man led 190 of 200 laps, broke the outright speed record, and wiped an entire generation of American racing machinery off the face of the earth in a single Sunday afternoon. And here is the part that should bother you. The people who were laughed at were right, and the people doing the laughing lost everything. This is Legacy Engines, and I spend way too much time thinking about the moments in motorsport history where one brilliant idea made everything that came before it look prehistoric. If you are someone who loves the stories behind the machines, the engineering gambles, the human drama, and the races that quietly rewrote history, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, before we get into the Lotus 38 and what it actually did to Indianapolis, we need to talk about what Indianapolis was. Because if you do not understand what Jim Clark and Colin Chapman were walking into, you will never fully appreciate how completely, how ruthlessly, and how permanently they destroyed it. Here's the thing. The Indianapolis 500 in the early 1960s was not just a race. It was a religion. It was the richest motorsport event on Earth, and it had been won, dominated, and shaped by one specific type of machine since the early 1950s, the front-engined roadster. These were not delicate machines. They were enormous, heavy, loud American cars with four-cylinder Offenhauser engines mounted up front, built by American craftsmen in American shops, refined over a decade into something approaching perfection in the eyes of the men who raced them. And those men were not soft. A.J. Foyt, Parnelli Jones, Roger Ward. These were hard, physical, uncompromising racers who had earned their place at the brickyard through years of brutal, oval racing. They did not tolerate tourists, and they certainly did not tolerate Europeans showing up with their dainty little Formula One cars and their polite accents and their ideas about how a racing car should be built. The formula at Indianapolis was simple, and it never changed, because nobody in the establishment believed it needed to. You arrived with a roadster. You muscled it around the 2.5-mile rectangle for 500 miles. You hoped your tires held together and your Offenhauser kept firing. And if you were tough enough and brave enough and lucky enough, you went home rich. And rich meant genuinely, life-changingly rich. The Indianapolis purse in those years was so much larger than anything available in European racing that it made the entire Formula One calendar look like pocket change. That prize money is exactly why the race attracted the best, hungriest, most dangerous drivers in American motorsport, and it is also exactly why a British constructor and a Scottish farmer decided the brickyard was worth taking on. Now, you might be thinking, surely the people running Indianapolis would have seen what was happening in Formula One and adapted. Here is what most is interesting. They did see it. They just did not believe it applied to them. By the early 1960s, rear-engine cars had already completely eliminated front-engine machines from Formula One. The old style of Grand Prix car, engine up front, driver sitting upright behind it, had been dead for years. Cooper and Lotus had proved beyond any argument that putting the engine behind the driver improved weight distribution, lowered the center of gravity, reduced aerodynamic drag, and made the entire car faster, more efficient, and more controllable. This was not a theory anymore. It was an established fact that the entire European racing world had accepted. But Indianapolis was different. At least that is what the establishment told itself. The oval demanded power and toughness and brute mechanical reliability. The lightweight European machines would fold under the stress of 4 hours at maximum speed on a concrete surface. The tires would go off. The engines would overheat. The drivers would get lost without the rhythm of chicanes and elevation changes to break up the monotony. The roadster men had 1,000 reasons why the funny cars from England would fail, and every single one of those reasons turned out to be a comfort they had invented for themselves. The invasion started with a handshake between a Californian and a Norfolk Englishman. Dan Gurney had raced in Formula One, and understood exactly what Lotus could do with a lightweight chassis. He had watched Chapman's cars dismantle the opposition in Europe, and he had done the mental arithmetic. A nimble, rear-engine car with a large American V8 dropped in behind the driver could absolutely devastate the roadsters at Indianapolis. The weight saving alone would transform the tire and fuel strategy. The aerodynamics would add straight-line speed. The lower center of gravity would make the car faster through the banked corners. Gurney became convinced, and he made the introduction that changed everything. He brought Colin Chapman to Indianapolis to watch the 1962 race in person. Chapman arrived as a tourist and left as a man with a plan. Look, this is the thing about Chapman that made him genuinely dangerous. He did not just see what was on the track. He saw the money. He saw the physics. And he saw a room full of people who had stopped asking questions. He looked at the roadsters and he did not see excellence. He saw an opportunity. He then met with Ford Motor Company executives who were looking for a way into the biggest motor race in America and who had the budget to fund a serious assault. The deal came together with very little drama. Lotus would build the car. Ford would build a purpose-designed V8. Dan Gurney and Jim Clark would drive. And the Indianapolis establishment, busy polishing their roadsters and counting their prize money, barely registered that it was happening. The first Lotus arrived at the Speedway in 1963, and the reaction was almost exactly what you would expect. The mechanics in Gasoline Alley called it a funny car. Lightweight, spindly, fragile-looking. The idea that this thing could last 500 miles was treated as a punchline. And then the man who was supposed to drive it walked out, and he did absolutely nothing to change the atmosphere. Jim Clark was a slightly built, quiet, polite sheep farmer from the Scottish borders who looked faintly bewildered by the circus surrounding him. He gave short answers to journalists. He avoided the parties. He seemed, to the hard men of American oval racing, like someone who had wandered into the wrong building. Parnelli Jones said years later that he and Foyt gave the Formula One contingent no respect whatsoever when they showed up. What Jones did not know was that the shy, quiet man by the funny green car was in the process of winning that year's Formula One World Championship, that Clark drove with a smoothness and gentleness that left his machinery almost untouched, which was, as it turned out, the single most valuable quality a driver could bring to a 500-mile race. The Brickyard veterans saw a lamb. They had it exactly backwards, and that first year proved it in the most painful, controversial way imaginable. Ready for Section 2 whenever you are. Hook for next section. Clark's first Indianapolis drove him to within touching distance of victory, and then an official with a flag he never waved took it away from him. Clark ran with the leaders all day in 1963. And as the pit stop strategies played out across the afternoon, the tiny green Lotus emerged as the genuine threat to Parnelli Jones and his roadster. Then Jones began leaking oil onto the racing surface, enough oil to make the track genuinely dangerous, and the black flag that every team had been explicitly warned about stayed in the official's pocket. Chapman was furious. He said openly what many American writers quietly agreed with, that if an Englishman had been leading and an American had been the one trailing oil, the flag would have come out immediately. Clark said almost nothing and let the result stand, because that was the kind of man he was. But the message from that afternoon was clear, and the establishment had heard it whether they admitted it or not. The funny car had nearly won on its very first attempt, and a fair-minded reading of that afternoon suggested it actually had. Chapman went home and started designing the car that would finish the job. For 1964, he brought a new Lotus with Ford's proper racing engine, the purpose-built 4-cam V8 that replaced the original pushrod unit, and Clark put it on pole position with a record-breaking run. The punchline was over. Even the most stubborn roadster man in Gasoline Alley could see which way the wind was blowing, because the evidence was right there on the timing screens. But on race day, Chapman's gamble on tire compound turned against him. The soft rubber that had allowed Clark to qualify so quickly could not survive the full race distance. The tread stripped away from his left rear, the flailing rubber tore into the rear suspension, and the car was done well before half-distance. A.J. Foyt went on to win, and afterward he made a point of celebrating in the direction of the foreign interlopers. What Foyt could not have known was that he had just taken the very last victory a front-engined roadster would ever score at Indianapolis. The old guard celebrated like the natural order had been restored. They were dancing at their own funeral. Chapman went home again, and this time he sat down with his designer Len Terry, and they went through every single weakness the previous 2 years had exposed, one by one, and they fixed all of them. The result was the Lotus 38, a full monocoque aluminum tub that made the car dramatically stiffer and safer. Bigger ventilated disc brakes, reworked suspension geometry. The entire chassis offset slightly between its wheels so the weight distribution favored the left, which was the only direction Indianapolis ever turned. Ford's quad-cam V8 running on alcohol fuel with constant flow injection producing around 500 horsepower, and Firestone tires chosen only after the team had run endless tests on full fuel loads to prove the rubber could last the distance. The whole machine weighed barely over 600 kilograms. For context, that is roughly half the weight of a modern family hatchback. The roadsters it was built to destroy weighed nearly double. Here's what most people do not realize about that development process. Chapman and Terry were not building a better version of what already existed. They were operating from a completely different set of assumptions. The roadster men improved their cars by making them stronger, more powerful, more durable. Chapman improved his by asking what the minimum possible weight was, what the minimum possible tire wear was, what the minimum number of pit stops was, and then designing every single component around those answers. It is the difference between adding armor to a tank and deciding not to build a tank at all. Two completely different philosophies sitting in the same garage area, and only one of them was going to survive the afternoon. When the finished Lotus 38 arrived at the speedway for the 1965 race, one of the team's mechanics said something that stuck. He remembered that there was almost nothing to do. They finished the car on schedule, pushed it out each morning. Clark went faster, and they put it away again. After 2 years of frantic scrambling, of tire failures and controversial black flags and heartbreaking mechanical failures, the team had built something that simply worked. There were no weaknesses left for the track to find. And while all of this was happening in the Lotus garage, something even more significant was taking place across the rest of the paddock, because Chapman and his funny cars had quietly changed the entire character of the field around him. This is where it gets really interesting. By the time qualifying opened in 1965, the Indianapolis 500 was no longer a battle between old and new. The old was already gone. Of the 33 cars that made the starting field, 27 had their engines behind the driver. Only 6 machines in the entire show still carried their power plants up front, and everyone in the garage area knew those 6 were racing for history rather than victory. The men who had spent years mocking the European machines had gone out and bought European machines, or copies of them, or hired engineers to build something similar. The funny car that everyone had laughed at in 1963 had so completely vindicated itself that it had restructured the entire grid in 2 seasons. And sitting on top of all of it, fastest of the fast, was Jim Clark in the Lotus 38, the first driver to officially break 160 miles per hour in qualifying at Indianapolis, setting records as he went. A.J. Foyt matched him and pushed him off pole position with an even quicker run. But look at what Foyt was driving to do it. A rear-engined car. The defending champion, the loudest voice the establishment had, was now racing in the type of machine he had spent years dismissing. That is not adaptation. That is capitulation dressed up as competition. And the man who had called Clark's car a joke was now sitting in something that operated on exactly the same principles, designed by the same revolution Chapman had started. The Roadster era did not end with a dramatic confrontation. It ended with its own champions quietly abandoning it and hoping nobody would notice. Now, before we get to race day, we need to talk about the decision that very few people remember properly, because it says more about Clark and Chapman than any lap time ever could. The 1965 Indianapolis 500 fell on the same weekend as the Monaco Grand Prix, the crown jewel of the Formula One calendar. The race every driver in Europe wanted to win above almost anything else. And Team Lotus looked at both events and walked away from Monaco without hesitation. Clark was defending the Formula One World Championship. Skipping Monaco meant handing free points to his rivals at the most prestigious single event in the series. The financial logic helped. Monaco paid its winner somewhere around £700. Indianapolis paid out a purse worth tens of thousands. But this was also unfinished business of the most personal kind. Clark had been robbed in 1963 and broken by mechanical failure in 1964. The brickyard owed him something, and he intended to collect it. The gamble looked enormous at the time. It turned out to be nothing of the kind, because Clark won Indianapolis, then went back to Europe and won the Formula One championship anyway. He remains to this day the only driver in history to win both the Indianapolis 500 and the Formula One World Championship in the same calendar year. The year he skipped Monaco to go to Indiana, he won everything else. Some bets are not bets at all. Some bets are made by people who already know how the story ends and are just waiting for everyone else to catch up. Ready for Section 3 when you are? Hook for the next section. On the morning of race day, the Wood brothers were quietly filing down a fuel nozzle in a garage, and nobody watching them had any idea that this was the moment the Roadster era officially died. The race strategy that Chapman built around the Lotus 38 is one of the most elegant pieces of tactical thinking in the history of the sport, and it rested on a very simple truth that the Roadster men had never had to confront. A lighter car is a better car in almost every measurable way over a long race. It stresses its tires less, which means the tires last longer and stay faster deeper into the stint. It burns less fuel per lap, which means fewer stops or smaller fuel loads. It puts less load through its brakes and suspension, which means those components survive the full distance with more margin to spare. Every advantage compounds across 500 miles, and the Lotus 38 had every advantage stacked in the same direction. Here is the specific number that tells the whole story. The Roadsters needed 2 or 3 pit stops across the race, and each stop meant a tire change as well as fuel, because the heavy cars simply destroyed their rubber. A competitive Roadster pit stop in those years took somewhere between a minute and a half. The Lotus, running so gently on its tires that the rubber showed almost no wear, needed only 2 fuel stops and no tire changes at all. And to make those fuel stops as short as humanly possible, Chapman brought in outside expertise of a kind that nobody in Indianapolis had ever seen at a Formula One effort. The Wood brothers were the stuff of legend in American stock car racing. Glenn and Leonard Wood ran a team out of Stuart, Virginia that was famous throughout NASCAR for the speed and precision of their pit work. Their mechanics had refined refueling and tire changing into something close to performance art, cutting seconds off stops that other teams measured in minutes. Chapman invited them to run the Lotus pit stops, and their arrival caused a visible stir in the paddock, because everyone at the speedway knew exactly who they were and what they could do. What the rest of the paddock did not see was what the Wood brothers did in the days before the race. They studied the Lotus gravity refueling system, identified every point where friction or resistance was slowing the fuel flow, and then quietly worked the nozzle connectors in and out of the coupling hundreds of times until every joint moved with absolute smoothness. By race morning, they could pour 50 gallons of alcohol fuel into the Lotus in well under 30 seconds. There is a story, and I have no reason to disbelieve it, that rival crews watched the fuel flowing into Clark's car during practice stops with their mouths open and went to ask Chapman what he was running to make it pour that fast. His answer was simple: pure alcohol, which is exactly what everyone else was running, but none of them had filed their nozzles down. The combination of minimal tire wear and ultra-fast refueling meant the Lotus 38 was going to spend less time standing still than any other competitive car in the field. While Roadsters burned through rubber and sat in the pits for 90-second stops, Clark would take fuel twice and go. The race could be won in the pits before Clark had turned a single competitive lap, and Chapman had made sure it was. And that is before we even talk about what Clark was capable of doing with the car once the green flag dropped. On the 31st of May, 1965, in front of a crowd estimated at around 300,000 people, one of the largest gatherings ever to watch a motor race anywhere in the world, Jim Clark settled the argument that had been building for 2 years. He took the lead on the opening lap. Foyt challenged him early, sitting on the Lotus's gearbox through the first few circuits, and for a moment the crowd got exactly the drama it had come to see. The American champion in the American car, harrying the quiet Scotsman around the rectangle, refusing to let the foreigner get comfortable. Then the gap started opening, and once it started, it never stopped. Clark surrendered the lead only twice across the entire afternoon, and both times it was because he was sitting in the pit lane taking fuel while everyone else was still racing. The moment he rejoined the circuit, he was back in front. Foyt's transmission disintegrated sometime past the halfway point, removing the establishment's last competitive hope. Parnelli Jones, the man who had taken the victory away from Clark under that cloud of oil 2 years earlier, drove as hard as he possibly could all afternoon and ran out of fuel on the very final lap, managing to coast to second place. Mario Andretti, a young man in his first Indianapolis 500, brought his car home third and won Rookie of the Year. Clark led 190 of the 200 laps. He won at an average speed of 150.686 miles per hour, the first time any driver had averaged over 150 for the full race distance. He was the first winner from outside the United States in 49 years. He finished nearly 2 minutes ahead of the car in second place. In a 500-mile race, 2 minutes is not a gap. It is a statement. It is a man standing in front of everything the opposition believed about racing and telling them politely that they had been wrong about all of it. Here is the thing about Clark's driving on that day that the statistics alone do not capture. The race was clean. Unusually, remarkably clean. The caution lights burned for barely 13 minutes across the entire afternoon. Clark had not simply won a chaotic race by surviving the attrition. He had won a clear race by being categorically, undeniably, humiliatingly faster than every other car on the circuit. There was no luck involved. There was no fortunate timing on the safety car. There was no mechanical failure by a faster rival. Clark led because the Lotus 38 was better and because Clark was the best driver in the field, and neither of those facts was ever seriously in dispute again. No front-engine roadster ever won the Indianapolis 500 after that afternoon. Within 2 seasons they had gone from fringe competitors to historical curiosities, parked in garages and museums while the rear-engine cars they had mocked filled every meaningful position on the grid. The template that Chapman and Terry laid down in that aluminum monocoque tub, engine behind the driver, weight pushed low and central, tires preserved through mechanical sympathy, race won in the pits as much as on the track, became the foundation on which every Indianapolis car built since has been designed. Every winner, every record, every lap led since 1965 has been turned by a car that carries its engine exactly where the funny car carried it, and every one of those victories is, in some indirect way, a consequence of what happened on that Sunday afternoon in Indiana. Ready for Section 4 when you are? Hook for next section. The men who called Clark's car a joke ended up building cars exactly like it. And that is not the strangest part of the story. The strangest part is what it did to the people who lost. Because the aftermath of the 1965 Indianapolis 500 is not simply a story about a race being won. It is a story about what happens when an entire community of experts is forced to confront the fact that its expertise was pointing in the wrong direction. The Roadster men were not stupid. They were not lazy. They were not technologically incurious. Many of them were brilliant engineers and mechanics who had spent years pushing the front-engine formula to its absolute limits, wringing every last tenth of a second out of a design concept that had been refined over a decade of hard racing. The problem was not their ability. The problem was their assumption. They had assumed that because the Roadster had worked, and worked brilliantly for so long, it must represent something close to an optimal solution. Chapman had not shared that assumption. He had looked at the same problem from a completely different starting point, and arrived somewhere the Roadster men had never thought to go. Look, this is the pattern that repeats itself through the history of technology, and motorsport just happens to be one of the places where it plays out fastest and most visibly, because the feedback loop is so short and so unambiguous. You cannot argue with a lap time. You cannot tell a stopwatch it has misunderstood the fundamental physics of the situation. When the Lotus 38 crossed the line 2 minutes clear of the field, the argument was over. And everyone in the Indianapolis paddock knew it was over, and they went home and they built rear-engined cars. All of them. Within 2 years the front-engine Roadster had not merely been beaten, it had been erased. Now, you might be thinking that this kind of thing, a sudden, total revolution driven by one outsider's idea, must be rare in motorsport. Here is what most people do not realize. It is actually the normal pattern. The history of racing is full of moments where the accepted wisdom turned out to be inertia dressed up as expertise, where the people doing things the established way had simply stopped questioning whether the established way was actually the best way. Chapman himself had done the same thing to Formula One a few years earlier, introducing the monocoque chassis to Grand Prix racing at a time when every serious constructor was building space-frame cars, because space-frame cars were what serious constructors built. The men who laughed at the Lotus 25 in its first Formula One season were driving cars based on its principles within 18 months. The Indianapolis Revolution was actually faster than that. The gap between Clark's first appearance with a funny car in 1963 and the complete elimination of the Roadster from competitive racing was barely 3 seasons. 3 seasons to overturn a decade of orthodoxy, restructure an entire grid, and permanently redirect the technological development of American single-seater racing. And it happened not because anyone in the establishment eventually agreed that Chapman was right, but because the stopwatch made the argument for him and nobody could find a counter-argument that worked. This is where it gets really interesting, because the Lotus 38 story does not end with the race. It continues in the career of the man who drove it, because Jim Clark's 1965 season stands as one of the greatest achievements in the history of motorsport when you look at it complete. He won the Indianapolis 500. He won the Formula One World Championship. He won 6 of the 10 Formula One Grand Prix he contested that year. He came back from the Monaco Grand Prix he skipped and won at Spa, one of the most demanding circuits in Europe, at a speed that left his rivals genuinely stunned. He set fastest lap in races he did not win. He drove for Lotus in Formula 2, in Tasman Series events, in whatever Chapman pointed him at, and he was almost always fastest. The 1965 season was not a collection of results. It was a demonstration, sustained across months and continents and completely different types of racing, that one particular combination of driver and designer had arrived somewhere ahead of everyone else and was not planning to wait for the rest of the field to catch up. Clark's driving style was the key to all of it, and it matters to the Indianapolis story specifically because of what the speedway demands. The track is physically simple. 4 left-hand corners connected by 2 long straights and 2 short ones. There are no chicanes, no elevation changes, no technical complexity of the kind that European circuits offer. What it demands instead is consistency. Hour after hour of laps that differ by fractions of a second, each one requiring the driver to place the car on exactly the same line, carry exactly the same speed, manage exactly the same forces through the tires and suspension. Most drivers can be fast. Very few drivers can be consistently fast across 4 hours in a way that keeps the machinery intact. Clark was the best in the world at this particular skill, and it was the skill the Lotus 38 was designed around. Here is a relatable way to think about it. Imagine you are driving on a motorway, and you are trying to get the best possible fuel economy from your car. The fastest overall time comes not from the moments when you are going flat out, but from the moments when you are managing everything smoothly, carrying speed rather than scrubbing it off and rebuilding it, reading the road far enough ahead that you never have to make harsh inputs. Clark drove a racing car the way a genuinely skilled long-distance driver uses a road car, and over 500 miles that smoothness compounded into an advantage that no amount of raw power from a roadster could overcome. The Firestone tire story deserves a moment of its own here, because it is one of the less told details of the 1965 campaign, and it mattered enormously. In 1964, Clark's tire gamble had cost him the race. The team had qualified on soft compound rubber and been forced to race on it, and the wear rate had been catastrophic. For 1965, Chapman and Clark went to Firestone and asked for tires that could last the full race distance on a rear-engined car. Firestone's engineers came to the speedway, fitted the test tires to the Lotus 38, and watched Clark drive lap after lap after lap on a full fuel load to see how the rubber behaved under actual race conditions. It was methodical, unglamorous work. It was also exactly the kind of work that separates teams that win once from teams that win consistently. By race day, they knew the tires would last because they had watched them last under conditions that replicated the race as closely as possible. There was no gamble in 1965. There was preparation, and preparation is just the name we give to gambles where someone has done the homework first. The Wood brothers' contribution also deserves to be understood in its full context, because it represents something that Chapman was extraordinarily good at throughout his career. He was willing to go outside his own expertise and bring in the best available help from wherever it existed, regardless of whether that help came from Formula One, or stock car racing, or aerospace engineering, or anywhere else. The Wood brothers were from a completely different racing culture. They worked on completely different cars for a completely different audience. Chapman did not care. He knew they were the fastest pit crew in American motorsport, and he hired them. And their presence in the Lotus pit was one of the factors that turned a fast car into an unbeatable one. This kind of cross-pollination, taking expertise from one domain and applying it to a different problem, is actually one of the most reliable routes to breakthrough performance in almost any field. It works in racing, it works in technology, it works in medicine, it works in business. The people who win consistently are rarely the ones who know the most about their own field. They are the ones who know enough about adjacent fields to recognize when something useful can be borrowed. Chapman was a master of this. The Lotus 38 was the product of aeronautical engineering principles applied to a racing chassis, European Grand Prix technology applied to an American oval, and stock car pit expertise applied to a Formula One operation. None of those combinations were obvious in 1964. All of them were undeniably correct by the evening of May 31, 1965. Ready for the final section. Hook. The last thing the Indianapolis establishment expected was that the man who beat them would be gone within 3 years, and that his absence would feel like a question the sport never stopped trying to answer. Jim Clark died at Hockenheim on the 7th of April, 1968. In a Formula 2 race that should have been routine, on a wet afternoon at a circuit that asked nothing of the car or driver that either of them had not handled 100 times before. The cause was never conclusively established. A tire failure was suspected, and aerodynamic instability was suggested. Nobody ever proved anything with certainty, and the uncertainty itself became part of the wound. Clark was 32 years old. He was the reigning Formula One world champion. He had won 25 Grand Prix, a record at the time. He had won Indianapolis. He had won in sports cars, in Formula 2, in the Tasman Series, on tracks that bore no resemblance to each other except for the fact that Clark arrived and went faster than everyone else. The racing world had never properly reckoned with the possibility that Clark might simply stop. Not retire, not slow down, not be beaten fair and square by someone better, but simply stop, without warning, on a forgettable Tuesday in Germany. Chapman was devastated in a way that people who knew him well said he never fully recovered from. The partnership between the two men had been one of the most productive in the history of the sport, and it had rested on a quality in Clark that Chapman understood better than anyone. Clark trusted the car. Whatever Chapman built, Clark drove without reservation. That trust, that absolute confidence in the machine, was what allowed Clark to extract performances from Lotus cars that other drivers could not reach. After Clark died, Chapman continued to innovate, continued to win, but something in the dynamic was gone. The Lotus 38 itself survived. The car that Clark drove to victory in 1965 exists today, restored and preserved, an artifact from the afternoon that changed American racing permanently. When you look at it, the thing that strikes most people is how small it is, how delicate, how completely unsuited it appears for the violence of 500-mile oval racing. And that appearance is exactly the point. It does not look like a car built for Indianapolis because it was not built according to Indianapolis logic. It was built according to entirely different logic, and that different logic happened to be correct. And the correctness of it was demonstrated so completely and so finally on that May afternoon that the question never had to be asked again. Here is the thing that I keep coming back to when I think about this story. The people who laughed at the Lotus 38 were not wrong to apply scrutiny. Scrutiny is right. Questioning whether an untested idea can survive the specific demands of a specific challenge is exactly what serious engineers and racers should do. The failure was not in questioning. The failure was in the confidence with which the establishment answered its own questions. They looked at the funny car and said it will not work, and they said it with such certainty, from such a position of established success, that they stopped genuinely testing the question. They had the answer before they ran the experiment. Chapman and Clark ran the experiment, and the experiment ran 190 laps at the front. What the 1965 Indianapolis 500 demonstrated is something that applies far beyond motor racing. Expertise that is not continuously challenged is indistinguishable from assumption. The Roadster men had expertise. They had decades of experience, successful results, technical knowledge, but their expertise had curdled into assumption because they had stopped asking whether their starting points were correct. Chapman's genius was not simply that he was smarter than the Roadster builders. It was that he kept asking the question they had stopped asking. Why does the engine have to be in front? Why does the car have to weigh this much? Why does the pit stop have to take this long? Every answer he found that was different from the established answer was an opportunity. And the Lotus 38 was the sum of all those different answers. The drivers who came after Clark at Indianapolis, Mario Andretti, Mark Donohue, Al Unser, the men who defined the following decade of oval racing, all of them raced rear-engine cars. All of them raced on tires chosen and tested with the kind of methodical preparation the Lotus team had introduced. All of them had pit crews whose work was measured in seconds rather than minutes, because the Wood brothers had shown what was possible and the entire sport had adapted. The revolution that looked like a stunt in 1963 had become the foundation of everything by 1970, and it has remained the foundation ever since. There has not been a front-engine car in serious contention at Indianapolis in 6 decades. And there will not be, because the physics that made the Roadster obsolete have not changed. Jim Clark crossed the finish line on the 31st of May, 1965, nearly 2 minutes ahead of anyone else, and became the first Indianapolis 500 winner to average over 150 miles per hour for the full race distance. He was cheered warmly by a crowd that had initially doubted him, in the way crowds always warm eventually to someone who is simply and completely and undeniably the best at what they do. A.J. Foyt, the man who had won the final Roadster victory the year before and had never let the Europeans forget it, went home and commissioned a rear-engine car. Parnelli Jones, the man whose oil-leaking Roadster had taken the victory from Clark in 1963, eventually came back to Indianapolis as a team owner running rear-engine machines. The conversion was total. The argument was closed. And the quiet sheep farmer from the Scottish borders got on a plane and went back to Europe, where he spent the rest of the summer winning Formula One races and collecting a second world championship. He said very little publicly about what he had done at Indianapolis. He was not a man who celebrated loudly, but the people who knew him well said he considered the 1965 Indianapolis 500 victory one of the most satisfying results of his career. Not because of the money, not because of the record, but because of what it had taken to get there. 2 years of near misses, 2 years of coming close enough to see the finish line and being denied it. 2 years of being told, directly and indirectly, and in every way a racing paddock can communicate its opinions, that his car and his team did not belong. And then one clean, controlled, dominant, uncontestable Sunday afternoon that made every one of those opinions irrelevant forever. The Lotus 38 was the car that America laughed at until it could not anymore. If there is a story in motorsport history that better illustrates what happens when the wrong people are confident and the right people are patient, I have not found it yet, and I spend a lot of time looking. If this story is your kind of thing, there are more of them on the channel. Hit subscribe, leave a comment with the machine you want covered next, and I'll make it worth the click.